In the Western anime community, there has been a growing discrepancy in the common usage of the word trap. What started as an amusing way to describe certain characters in anime has become a politicized term, with its meaning lost, both due to inaccurate application and through endless repetition of the word as mimetic internet slang. While people may have a general understanding of what the word implies, the aesthetics and connotations are often misunderstood and bring further confusion into discussions. As such, a proper definition of trap and its applications must be established. The term trap was created by Western anime fans, specifically people from the website 4chan, to describe androgynous cross-dressing characters, typically appearing to be female. If a person were to ask on 4chan what defines a trap, a common answer would be, draw a girl, say it's a boy. While this is an adequate summary of the topic that also hints at its fundamental elements, it is not sufficiently comprehensive where one can explain the central meaning behind its usage. The answer goes further than simple androgyny and cross-dressing, and it is found in the two components that prescribe meaning and value in visual mediums: the aesthetic principle present in all of anime and the narrative through which a story is told. The first step towards understanding the connotations of traps begins by asking, how do you determine that a character is a girl? In anime, there are defining features by which the audience can identify with near certainty the gender of a character, from general attitude to clothes and body structure. But these variables are unreliable, societally dependent, and do not consistently apply. A method that has never been consciously acknowledged by most people is looking at an aesthetic trait that distinguishes anime from all other mediums: the eyes. More so than anything else, there is a general tendency for the eyes of anime characters to be bound to their age and sex. If a character is a child, they will have larger eyes by default, to convey a sense of cuteness and innocence. Once a character enters puberty, feminine characters will retain their large eyes throughout most of their life, while the eyes of masculine characters will begin to shrink. Certain teenage male characters may still have larger eyes, although this is used aesthetically to show that they have not yet matured. Once a character has reached adulthood, the difference between the size of the eyes becomes much more prevalent as a clear way for the audience to be able to differentiate between the genders. Female characters will continue having large eyes, but they will eventually begin to shrink as they enter adulthood until their twilight years. Of course, there are some exceptions to this process and tendency, such as certain male characters retaining their large eyes to denote innocence, or female characters having smaller eyes to be threatening or to show maturity. However, these are exceptions rather than the rule. The size of a character's eyes are attributes that denote their innocence or lack thereof. But it is also generally used in anime to differentiate the genders. And by watching enough anime, this awareness of the disparity between the sexes becomes subconsciously ingrained and is taken as fact, even if the audience is not conscious of the aesthetic difference. This equally applies to associated mediums including manga, video games, and visual novels. However, the existence of traps directly contradicts this aesthetic principle. When someone looks at a character with large eyes, wearing female-coded clothes, and have a feminine body, they have no reason to assume that such a character is of the opposite sex. It is only when the character reveals their actual biological sex, or another character in the story confirms it, that the narrative establishes their sex to the audience. The problem is that even if the character is identified by the narrative as one sex, their aesthetics still convey the opposite meaning. They have large eyes, which signifies, subconsciously, that they are female. The irony is that, in most cases, if the topic of their gender were never brought up by the narrative, no one in the audience would be able to tell that a character is of the opposite sex to the one indicated by their aesthetics. There also exists an alternate variation, commonly referred to as a reverse trap, where a female character is mistaken for the opposite gender. Haruhi from the anime Ouran High School Host Club is a good example of this. In the first episode, she is dressed in baggy clothes, and, more importantly, shining glasses cover her eyes. And she is revealed to have always been a girl when she changes into the female school uniform and removes her glasses. Arguably, if Haruhi had not worn this attire, the audience could have immediately figured out her gender. In general, reverse traps tend to be more obvious than their male counterpart by still having larger eyes, thereby giving the audience a greater clue to their gender. Tomboy-type characters can also fit this definition, although they may not be cross-dressing but simply wearing androgynous or masculine clothes. These types of characters do not forego their femininity or gender. They simply tend to act more masculine, so it is pointless to refer to them as traps. The best example of a true reverse trap is the character Yukishima from the anime Gekkan Shoujo Nozaki-kun. Rather than simply appearing as a tomboy, she displays aesthetic male traits, and consistently has smaller eyes when compared to the other girls in the cast. Etymologically, the contradiction between the aesthetics and narrative is where the word trap originates from. By introducing a trap character, its creators are intentionally tricking the audience by going against the aesthetic principle. Audiences subconsciously acknowledge a character's gender by their aesthetics. But when the narrative goes against that rigid order by revealing that a character is of the opposite sex, it forces the conscious mind to be in conflict with itself. On the internet, it has become somewhat of a self-referential meme, where people ask if a trap is gay, by which they mean whether a person is gay if they are sexually attracted to a character that is revealed to be a trap. Assuming that the audience is male and heterosexual, the answer is that it is natural for people to be sexually inclined towards a character that displays objective feminine traits, since it is principally the aesthetics by which audiences can determine a character's gender in anime. Overall, a trap is still aesthetically presented as a girl because, even after the reveal, the objectively feminine aesthetic remains the most dominantly apparent element. Therefore, it is not gay even after the narrative reveals that a character is of the opposite sex. Regardless of what people generally think on this issue, it is not revealing the biological sex of traps and making a person doubt their sexuality that causes ambiguity and anxiety, but the contradiction caused when the aesthetic and narrative transmit opposite information. The two elements convey to the audience that a character is both male and female at the same time. The mind is incapable of accepting this inherent contradiction because the metaphysical law of identity requires that everything which exists in reality have a specific nature, that something cannot be itself and something else at the same time. A good example of a character considered a trap that does not have any contradictions between the aesthetic and narrative is the character Rui from the anime Gatchaman Crowds. He wears feminine clothes, yet follows anime's rigid aesthetic conventions by having smaller eyes compared to the rest of the female cast. In this context, Rui should not be classified a trap, but simply a male character that cross-dresses. However, because Rui technically has larger eyes compared to the rest of the male cast to aesthetically convey his innocence and naivete, it is understandable that individuals consider the character a trap. If more anime characters followed the aesthetic principle of their biological sex as to not transmit opposite information, audiences would more likely describe these types of characters as cross-dressers instead of traps. So, now that a clear foundation has been established, we can transition to the growing discourse in the Western anime community regarding whether the word trap is inherently transphobic. The term trap, in of itself, is not inherently a transphobic word, because transphobia is a term that applies to individuals who express irrational, excessive fear, disgust, and general negative attitudes towards transgender individuals. And the concept, under its true definition, only has applicable meaning when used to describe the contradiction between the fixed anime aesthetic and the narrative within a piece of media. However, due to never being properly defined and the improper discourse around it, people have come to believe that trap is a shorthand of entrapment in any context. In anime, when a trap character is introduced, its creators are intentionally contradicting the established aesthetic by which the genders are differentiated. But in real life, transgender individuals simply desire to express their self-identity. When a person applies this distorted definition of trap to a trans person, it prescribes to trans people the malicious motive of seeking to entrap others by pretending to be of the opposite gender. Unlike in anime, where the creators are intentionally going against the fixed aesthetic, it is impossible to make the assumption that trans people are seeking to entrap anyone. In the worst cases, transphobic people intentionally make this implication by saying that a trans person is a trap and insinuating that they desire to cause harm and anxiety in some sexual or social manner. These actions are purposefully done in an attempt to strip trans individuals of their identity. Indeed, bigoted individuals have appropriated the word for wicked purposes, even if it did not originate as an insult. In the best cases, several people have innocently misused the word trap to casually describe trans people in what they intend to be a compliment, by insinuating that they would not have been able to recognize that they have ever changed genders. The same way people look at characters that are traps and would not have been able to recognize that they are of the opposite gender. However, regardless of intent, when used outside of a fictional context, by describing a trans person as a trap, it can be taken as the equivalent to saying that they are a cross-dresser, playing make-believe by wearing clothes of the opposite gender while seeking to trick people deliberately. That implication, intentional or not, becomes derogatory by insinuating that society should not acknowledge their gender identity. Calling a trans person a trap can be considered a microaggression at best, but at worst, it is harassment. Due to its widespread misapplication, certain people have concluded that any usage of the word trap is more than merely derogatory and acts as a slur, regardless of context. They hope that if the word is removed from common usage, any discomfort or harm caused by its existence will be avoided altogether. However, this involves improperly declaring trap as an inherent slur and overruling its true definition and utility for describing anime characters, further creating miscommunication among people that may not even know what the concept even means. To many, merely allowing the word trap to exist is interpreted as directly insulting trans people and fostering a toxic culture that leads to the suffering and harm of trans individuals. It is important to remember that trap characters are not real people. They are merely fictional drawings and cannot be offended by how we identify them. But because the word has become so widely used outside the context of anime, the concept of trap has been seen by many as becoming politicized and reduced to nothing more than a slur. Calling a trans person a trap is offensive as it mocks their identity. The problem is that when a word is misused so frequently and only heard in a derogatory context, the connotative baggage can be so strong that it effectively destroys the original meaning. When a word is consistently used to insult a person or a group of people, then regardless of the etymology, that word becomes culturally perceived as nothing more than an insult. As a result, many people within the trans community or those that are sympathetic to their cause, argue that people should stop using the word trap entirely and use other possible synonyms such as joshu and otokonoko. But that attempt, although well-intentioned, is flawed because the word trap has a specific meaning which is worth preserving compared to those suggested alternatives. Although very intertwined, joshu and otokonoko each have different meaning from the concept trap. Joshu is the act of dressing up in women's fashion and acting the part. It can be a synonym to cross-dressing. A person who does joshu will present and perform in their interpretation of the gendered style of their attire, be it dressing like a princess, a schoolgirl, or any other style that fits the description. It is something that is enjoyed by people of various genders and has been a part of Japan's gender non-conforming subculture for decades. Otokonoko translates to a male daughter, which refers traditionally to a person who is assigned male at birth who is now doing joshu in a seductive way. However, that is not to say that it is considered a positive term at large. It is a fetish term, and the people who self-identify as such tend to do so either because they have a desire to be openly sexual or because they are a sex worker of some kind. For example, if you were to browse Japanese amateur porn, you can find a lot of open trans women and ex-gender performers who will use the term. Essentially, those two words are used to describe a subculture in Japan regarding cross-dressing, and many anime fans have used otokonoko interchangeably with trap. However, neither joshu or otokonoko refer to the aesthetic being contradicted by the narrative from which the word trap derives its foundational meaning. The core problem when recommending an alternative word to trap is that people tend to think it merely means and represents cross-dressing, thereby attempt to find any word which may be roughly synonymous to it. People have argued that the Japanese use otokonoko when discussing anime characters that are considered to be traps by the Western anime community. But, unfortunately, this is not enough of a justification to change the word. The Japanese use terminology based on cross-dressing subculture to describe trap characters. For them, this is adequate, as all these characters inherently cross-dress. However, in the West, even if never properly defined, the concept of trap not only signifies cross-dressing as a secondary function, but primarily refers to the contradiction between the aesthetic and the narrative in anime. Equally, what the Japanese use as a word is not grounds for its replacement in the public lexicon. For example, the word tsundere, in reference to the character archetype that describes the development of a person who was initially cold or hostile before gradually showing a friendlier side over time, was identified and labeled by the Japanese. Some within the trans community have argued that if people can appropriate the word tsundere, the Western anime community should be able to do the same by using the word otokonoko instead of trap. But this is an intellectual sleight of hand and a misunderstanding of how words are created and appropriated, as well as how language is used. Everyone appropriated tsundere because the concept did not have an equivalent name in any other language. Similarly, the etymology of trap came from Western anime fans to describe the concept of a character archetype within anime itself. But in comparison, Japan did not identify characters that convey opposite contradictory information between the aesthetic and narrative as a new concept, and instead used names of cross-dressing subcultures from outside the medium of anime to label trap characters. This external association process inadvertently weakens the fundamental definition by miscategorizing the character archetype. Unlike what people generally believe, names are not merely language games, where one can just use whatever word they want at random to associate anything they wish or desire, disassociated with reality or its object. Names are important because they are perpetual symbols that allow people to identify a concept or concrete. But before we can discuss whether changing the word trap is possible, it is essential to understand the foundations of epistemology and its relation to forming concepts. At its core, language is a cognitive tool that denotes concepts, which allows communication of those concepts to be understood. We look at patterns within reality, identify individual entities, and isolate their characteristics among other entities within a range. When a multitude of entities has traits that are similar to one another but different from the traits of other entities, we group them together into a concept. Once the fundamental characteristics are identified, they define the concept, and it becomes labeled under a name for the purpose of communication. This epistemological method is the process by which we create concepts. They are generalities about concrete facts which allow people to grasp reality. So, ignoring when anime uses the aesthetic to convey innocence or lack thereof, as per the established universal, what generally differentiates the genders in anime is that males will have smaller eyes and females will have larger eyes. A traditional trap character aesthetically looks similar to female characters but are differentiated once revealed that they are biologically male. Trap characters become categorized as a separate concept between the similarity and differentiation of aesthetically traditional male and female characters. Inductively, the trap archetype becomes defined as the deliberate contradiction between the aesthetic and narrative in a fictionalized setting. Furthermore, the definition of a real trap is a device or stratagem intended to trick or fool an unsuspecting target. As such, it is understandable that such character archetype became labeled as trap, since both share similar essential characteristics and utility. The core problem is that attempting to remove or change the identification of a concept inadvertently corrupts it. By attempting to replace trap with a word that the Japanese used to identify cross-dressing subcultures, it will only further create disassociation with the denotation of the concept. Even if Japanese audiences use the terms this way, suggested alternatives such as joshu and otokonoko do not encapsulate all the fundamentals which define the concept trap. Ultimately, the word trap is a perfect representation of the concept that it denotes. By educating people on the actual meaning of the concept of traps and highlighting that the misapplication of the term is derogatory when used towards a living person, it will prevent people from describing transgender individuals as traps. Attempting to employ prohibition as a solution, such as proclaiming that the word should never be used or else it will make trans people suffer in some form or another, will only lead to further misunderstanding, shaming, and a lack of respect on all sides. People must learn to never use the term outside the context of describing fictional characters. Perpetually associating trans people with traps only obfuscates the concept while fueling the arguments of certain groups to redefine trap as a slur so that it stops being used entirely in the public lexicon. It is paramount to respect the identity of trans people and to treat them as individuals with dignity, like any other human with rights. So, it must be said again, only fictional characters can be traps. No one should ever describe any real individual as a trap. However, simply telling people not to call any trans individual a trap is not enough. There are aesthetic aspects associated with traps which are similarly present in trans characters within the medium of anime, and these are worth addressing. Trans characters fundamentally desire to be identified as a specific non-cisgender, which requires them to wear gender-coded clothes. It leads to an interesting overlap between those characters and traps. What primarily defines the aspect of being a trans person are the struggles and desires of self-expression by self-identifying as the gender of a person's choosing beyond the biological, becoming a representation of who they truly wish to be. The physical transition can be accomplished primarily through surgery and hormone therapy, but also with secondary cosmetic aspects such as clothing and makeup. To be seen as one gender over the other, anime characters do not require surgery or medication because of the idealization inherent in the medium. When characters have large eyes as one of their characteristics, it effectively permits them greater fluidity as to their gender and method of self-expression. Cross-dressing becomes the first step in the process of self-identification for several trans characters. A popular example is the character Shu from the anime Horu Musuko. She has large eyes and desires to be seen as a girl. However, it is not enough for Shu to present herself as female. The process of expressing self-identification only begins when she desires to wear feminine clothes. But despite having larger eyes that complement the feminine aesthetic and wearing female clothes, multiple characters within the story do not accept her self-expression. In a sense, characters in anime are not self-aware of the importance of the eyes. But trans characters do not require large eyes to present themselves as the opposite gender. What is important is being able to express self-identity by choosing their gender beyond biological sex. Trans women, such as the character Isabel Yamamoto from the movie Paradise Kiss, Hana from the movie Tokyo Godfather, and Grail Sutcliffe from Black Butler, all have smaller eyes because they are no longer teenagers. Intrinsically, they remain biologically male, and, in line with that fact, are still depicted following the aesthetic principle. However, the importance of not having large eyes to be aesthetically seen as feminine is de-emphasized by wearing feminine clothes. And, in the opposite direction, characters that are in their childhood are aesthetically neutral because, regardless of gender, childlike characters almost always have larger eyes. Evoking cuteness and innocence are traits that extend to female characters but apply to virtually all children until they pass adolescence. For example, the character Lily from the anime Zombieland Saga is indicated to be transgender. The character was unwilling to accept that their body was changing during puberty and died of shock. But as a result of being a zombie, Lily will never become older. She will remain 12 years old and be able to keep the aesthetics of her large eyes. Due to this, by being aesthetically gender neutral, Lily is capable of being presented as either a boy or a girl. But as with other trans characters, she is not a trap because she prefers to self-identify with her female stage name. Another similar example is the character Aluka from the anime Hunter x Hunter. The members of the Zoldyck family refer to her using male pronouns, and, according to the official guidebook, Aluka was biologically born male. However, Killua refers to her using female pronouns, which has led many to accept that Aluka identifies herself as a girl, and that she is trans. In both examples, Lily and Aluka are identified as children because they are equally 12 years old. By having large eyes, they share the similar aesthetics of all children in anime, which facilitates fluidity in their gender expression. While anime aesthetics present children as neutrally gendered until they pass puberty, nothing is preventing a child from expressing themselves before that period. Ultimately, beyond the aesthetic, what defines all these characters as transgender is the self-identification as a specific non-cisgender. As shown, there are clear aesthetic similarities when defining trap and trans characters in regards to gender fluidity, but it is equally important to draw the line and emphasize the difference between the two as to prevent future misunderstanding. By presenting an epistemological trichotomy, we can firmly identify, classify, and differentiate between a trap and a trans character. The best way to establish this is with the popular character Felix from the anime ReZero that can be considered either a trap or a trans character depending on whether a person is watching the anime or reading the light novel. The first layer is the objective conveyance from the aesthetic. Epistemologically, objectivity is that which is being perceived consciously and the active cognitive process of conforming one's thoughts in adherence to reality. The standard by which a person can be objective is through the logical interpretation of sense data to reach non-contradictory conclusions from the facts of reality. From a surface-level observation, Felix is shown to wear feminine clothes, act as a girl, and have large eyes. Without any further information, based on the established parameters and generality of female characters in anime, the audience would have to assume that Felix is female. The second layer is the intrinsic element, where it is revealed that Felix is biologically male. Intrinsicism is reality, that which exists independent from perception. While the feminine attributes aesthetically classify the character as female when compared to male characteristics, Felix is intrinsically male by being born male biologically, regardless of what is observed or known by a perceiver. By learning Felix's sex, the character is identified objectively as a trap because of the deliberate contradiction between the aesthetically feminine elements and the declared intrinsic narrative information regarding their sex. The last layer is the subjective element. What gender does Felix self-identify? Epistemologically, subjectivity is the interpretation of reality through values or truth statements derived internally, without reference to facts outside of the self. Different from a person's biological sex, gender is a tool of subjective self-identification which can go against the intrinsic. With most traps, they either remain silent about their preferred gender or heavily imply that they still identify with their biological sex. They cross-dress for fun, and it has no bearing on their underlying gender identity. A character only becomes trans if they self-define themselves as a specific non-cisgender, confirmed by the narrative through pronouns or a new self-identified name, regardless of what the aesthetic implies. In the light novel, Felix looks in a mirror and, despite acknowledging that they were born male, self-identifies as female. This subjective proclamation of self-identification is the line between traps and trans characters. So, to summarize, is Felix a girl, a trap, or a trans character? Well, that depends on how much information has been obtained to reach the absolute truth. If people have watched enough anime to know the difference between both sexes subconsciously and have only seen an image of Felix without any further context or prior information, they can declare that the character objectively looks feminine. Therefore, in this context, Felix is aesthetically classified as a girl. If the audience has experienced the anime where it is revealed by the narrative that Felix is intrinsically male, yet aesthetically looks female, then he is a trap. But if the audience has read the light novel where Felix declares their subjective self-identity, only then can they classify her as a trans character. Knowledge is the retained awareness of the facts of reality. It is contextual with all the information obtained from observation and changes according to new information about the identity of a subject. And with that established, there can be no further mistakes in how we identify and classify characters in anime. The miscommunication and misunderstandings regarding the concept of traps have led the Western anime community into a state of disarray. Too many people are mindlessly defensive about its usage, while others are too fanatical in their desire that it be removed entirely. Resolving these dead-end arguments on the internet will only happen once everyone recognizes the accurate definition of trap. That it is the deliberate contradiction between the aesthetics and the narrative with the intent of tricking the audience and that it can only be used to identify fictional characters. As much as it is disappointing to see the word become politicized, used as an insult towards trans people, both in the real world and on the internet, to the extent of causing a counter outcry that its use should be shamed out of existence, the implicit concept of trap has not changed. And hopefully, if people can recognize its explicit definition, it never will.
I sense a trap.
Next move?
Spring the trap.